Oh, evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Apologies for the slight delay there while we ironed out some technical gremlins. It's pretty dreary evening here in West London, so I hope it's more pleasant wherever you are. Do let us know, as always, where you're joining us from tonight and how you're getting on. Uh, my name is Paul Drobera. I'm currently chair of the British Association for Local History. Welcome tonight to the first in our new annual, sorry, our now annual series of lectures in collaboration with the Historic Towns Trust. This is the fifth year we've now been running the series, and in that time we've covered every corner of Britain, including places now lost, and we've even mapped murders committed by women in medieval English towns. I firstly wanted to pay tribute to our digital team at BALH, who administer and run the webinars so expertly, but especially the trustees of the Historic Towns Trust who've developed the programme every year. And it's to them, as well as our brilliant speakers, we have to thank for such stimulating and innovative local history research. Now, I'm actually only popping in briefly tonight to introduce the series. In the chair for tonight's lecture by David Bowler on mapping historic Perth will be John Moore, an expert on Scottish cartography, a previous speaker in the series, and one of the trustees of the Historic Towns Trust. And our question and answer session will be handled by my colleague at BALH, Laurie Yeoman. Just before we kick off, though, the usual Zoom housekeeping. As you know, or many of you will know, for all of our webinars, we use Zoom Webinar, which is slightly different to your standard Zoom meetings, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. So you won't be able to see yourself on screen, and everyone's muted. That's perfectly normal, and it's just so that we can help the webinar go as smoothly as possible. Now, there is a Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, towards the right-hand side, or at least it is on mine. If you've got any questions throughout the webinar that you'd like to ask to David, please drop them into the Q&A box, and we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. The chat function's also open, so do use that to check in with us, particularly if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, or if you've got resources you'd like to share during the webinar. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to John Moore, who will take us through the lecture. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me. And good evening to everyone. As Paul said, my name's John Moore, and apart from being the Secretary of the Historic Towns Trust, I am the one trustee resident north of the border. So I'm particularly delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. David Bowler is Director of Alder Archaeology based in Perth and offers advice to developers and individuals on a range of relevant topics. He's a past president of the Perthshire Society of Natural Science and the author of two very important monographs on the origins and archaeology of Perth. So he really knows a lot about Perth, which I'm very pleased about because last year the Historic Towns Trust, in association with the Perthshire Society of Natural Science, published a historic map of Perth, and David was in at the beginning and acted as an advisor to us. I don't think there's really very much else I need to say. I'm sure that his talk tonight on finding historic Perth will be an excellent start to this year's programme. Over to you, David.
Oh. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Can John hear me?
Yes, yes.
Very good, yes. I'll just take a second to share a screen, and that's beginning to look hopeful.
Yes.
And there we are. If I've got it right, you should all be seeing a view of Perth looking northwards. Can John see that?
Yep. Yes, I can.
Excellent. Then we're ready to roll. So as John has explained, this talk emerged out of the development of an historical map of Perth in 2024 by the Perthshire Society of Natural Science and the Historic Towns Trust. Historic Perth is particularly suitable to be mapped and to be understood in mapping terms. First of all, because we know so much about it. Archaeological work's been going on in Perth since the 1970s. So we have lots and lots of things to put on our map. And secondly, because Perth, more than most Scottish boroughs, has a particularly compact and intelligible form, which owes a lot to the natural topography. And so once you get your eye in, it all makes sense. And maps are a particularly good way of understanding it. So Perth is what it is because of where it is. It's not on, it's towards the center of Scotland, but on the River Tay, which drains eastwards and out into the North Sea. So Perth is at the lowest crossing of the Tay and at the upper limit of navigation and in sight of the Highland boundary fault. So what John Shirley, when he was describing the murder of James I of Scotland in 1437, called the country of the wild Scots. Perth's bounded by the Tay and the north and south inches and rising glacial terraces to the west. Now let's try something. I hope you can possibly see my pointer as I move around here. That's Smeaton's Bridge, which is the oldest surviving bridge across the Tay. And up there to the north is the Highland boundary fault. So you really are in sight of the Highland boundary fault here. That's the North Inch on the north side of historic Perth. And that's the South Inch on the south side, inch from the Old Gaelic Inish meaning island. And the inches really are water meadows that flood in extreme conditions and have been open ground really since the origins of medieval Perth. There's the actual medieval core of the borough in the centre of the modern built-up area, bounded by the Tay. And as you can see, at this, what was in historic times, the lowest crossing point of the Tay. That's a much more modern bridge, Friarton Bridge, farther downstream. If we move on to the next view.
David, very sorry to interrupt. This is Paul here. We're getting lots of messages, and I may agree with them. We can't see your pointer because the slides aren't showing full screen on our view.
Are they not? Now let's see if I
No, so
can.
we can see your, as we had before, you're sort of with the slide navigation bar on the left.
Right. Let me see if I can.
Do what you did before when you shared the entire
Yes,
screen. That should
I
be right.
wonder now if I can work out what I did before. Let's see, because there was always an element of trial and error in getting it to do what we want it to do.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, if you click on the slideshow, and then hopefully
yes,
it should.
let me see if it will let me do that. I'm going to have to escape for a moment then.
Apologies, everyone.
Yes, the joys of the technology. I'm going to come out of sharing just for a minute. Try and persuade it to go back to the slideshow. And then can you see anything at the moment?
Not yet.
No. We will, don't worry, we will get there in the end.
We're in the screen sharing now starting. That's good. So we got the same view as we had before with your navigation bar on the
Yes,
left.
yes. I thought you were
So yeah, so
getting that.
slideshow, yeah.
If it will allow me to do the slideshow. How are we doing now?
Still the same. It's not changing. Because you did something before when we were practicing, which did work.
I know. So, uh,
Ah, here we go. That's it. Perfect.
good. Are we all in business again? Excellent.
Looks like it to me.
Good, good. Yes. Are you seeing my pointer moving?
I can see that now. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else can. Can other people in the
Yes, I
chat
can see
confirm?
it
Yeah.
too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Great,
Cheers.
great, yes. Okay, we are in business again. Right, as I was saying, there is the Highland Boundary Fault. There is the medieval core of Perth. There's the North Inch, there's the South Inch. There's a much more modern bridge down there. So let us move on to the next view. What you're seeing here is the 18th century Smeaton's Bridge across the River Tay, and we're looking northwards here. And the reason I'm showing you this rather dark and gloomy slide, which was taken many, many years ago in midwinter, is because it shows us something else as well. There in the water, you can see a line of turbulence across the stream, which is showing the line of the very first crossing point over the Tay. That's where the old bridge was until it was destroyed by one of many floods. Here on the left, this is the west bank of the Tay. This is Tay Street, which is an 1870s embankment inserted into the town plan. And there on the east bank is the suburb of Bridgend, which is a long-established medieval extension of Perth. And so we're looking northwards up the Tay, and so the Tay is coming down from the country of the Wild Scots, flowing past Perth, and then it will turn eastwards and out into the North Sea. And if we move on to our next view, that is Perth as it might have been about 1027, 100 years before it became a royal borough. We're now looking eastwards across to Bridgend, and there is the nucleus of the very early medieval settlement on ever so slightly raised ground, with the parish church, St. John's Kirk, just there. This is the beginnings of the high street emerging and exiting the town westwards. And there, very slightly offset from the high street, is this rather low timber bridge, which crosses the Tay. And from there, you can then, if you really want to, you can go down this way. Later on, you'd be able to go to Dundee this way, but not this early. There's Kinnoul Parish Church, and there's a road disappearing over the hills, and that's the inland route to Dundee. And that road there would take you to Scone Abbey, which was an even older centre than Perth. Notice this sort of green, almost a rectangle, but not quite, which is the very slightly raised ground, surrounded by wet, boggy ground on all sides, which means that Perth is really developing on a naturally defensible site at a crossing point of the Tay. There's a few little boats that have made their way up from the North Sea to the ultimate limit of navigation. This area here, that in later years will get the name of the Magnum Stagnum, the great pond or pool, and Mill Street will form along here. Methven Street will form along here, and Canal Street along there, enclosing the medieval settlement into a sort of natural moat. And so that gives the borough the very distinctive shape and form and character that it has. You'll notice that the parish kirk seems to be enclosed by a sort of ditch with a burial ground inside it. This enclosure is not just artistic license. We did actually excavate that back in the 1980s at on a site called 80 to 86 High Street, on the south side of the High Street. And there you see this very narrow and very deep ditch lined with a wattle lining, which very usefully gave us a radiocarbon date to about 1027, which is about 100 years before the settlement gets its official name of being St. John's Town and a royal borough. So, yes. The other thing to remember about Perth, and which really defines its shape and its form, is that the River Tay is extremely prone to flooding. I remember many years ago when I lived in London, before the Thames Barrage was created, watching the Thames flood at high tide in what were really sort of slack water conditions. The Tay floods in a quite different way. It floods in the latter part of winter when the snow up in the hills melts suddenly. And so you go from quite low water quite suddenly to water going past the bridge at 15 knots with trees floating in it, and a sudden influx of water coming in off the Tay. And in those conditions, you get the pattern that we're seeing here. This is an extreme flood event, and you can see how it's squeezing the town into its very early medieval form. There's St. John's Parish Church right there on naturally high ground. The high street's on naturally high ground. That's the emergence of the northern defensive circuit there. That's an 18th century artifact. That's the approach ramp to Smeaton's Bridge. This area here is the Magnum Stagnum that I pointed out earlier. And so you can see how high flood levels define the natural boundaries of medieval Perth and dictate where the settlement first grows up. And there, that street there is on a natural dry ridge and is called Watergate. And that may well be the earliest nucleus, along with St. John's Kirk, of the medieval borough. There's Watergate as it is more or less today, though this is actually a few years ago now, as quite a narrow street, but you can see how it rises in the middle. We're looking north here, and the street rises, then drops down again onto the high street. And this may be one of the very earliest parts of the medieval borough, in effect, running along parallel to the waterfront. And we should imagine it perhaps with boats drawn up on the foreshore beyond these buildings. And this being a little harbour town developing on the river, a little bit like Stromness in Orkney today. The natural proneness to flooding and the natural wetness of the ground has had an enormous impact on the way that Perth developed and the way that its archaeology developed. This is that excavation I mentioned, 80 to 86 High Street. And what you may notice, there is modern street level where that chestnut paling is. This is the basement of an 18th century and perhaps earlier building. And then below basement level, all these deep black deposits are waterlogged midden deposits. You can see the water seeping up into these rubbish pits and wells here, for example. And what's happened is that as the town develops, fairly lightly constructed buildings are just demolished when they reach the end of their working lives, patted down, and a new building is put up on top. And so gradually the depth of midden and archaeology gets deeper and deeper until eventually the modern street level is up to 2 meters higher than the original natural ground level, which is why Perth has such remarkable archaeology. The waterlogged midden deposits preserve all sorts of things: bone, leather, wood, textiles, all the sort of organic materials that are normally lost, but which survive because of the extreme anaerobic, permanently wet conditions. So all of the kind of the debris of daily life gets preserved and sealed in these deep midden deposits in the center of Perth. And not only that, but the actual smell of all these deposits survives. When we've excavated in the town centre, it's quite a remarkable sulphurous sort of smell. The whole of the borough centre had all these wells which provided drinking water and cesspits for an obvious purpose, often in close proximity, which did tend to present all sorts of health problems. But it means that the whole of Perth in the centre sits on this deep deposit of black, dark, smelly, glutinous material. On top of which you then get the 18th and 19th century masonry buildings and the rubble from demolishing them. Rather like a sort of crust. I've often explained to people that the core of medieval Perth is not unlike a cowpat with a sort of crust on top of it. And I've said before that for some reason, Visit Scotland has never taken up the idea of Perth as a cowpat, as a natural selling point for tourism to Perth. But it does explain why we have so much archaeology. Around St. John's Kirk, which is the medieval church at the centre of Perth, the ground level has also risen. The building as you see it today owes quite a lot to a 1920s restoration by Sir Robert Lorimer. But the core of the building is still the church as it's mentioned in charters going back to the 1120s, the time of David I, when it's referred to as part of the King's own borough of Perth, which gives us our earliest reference to Perth as a royal borough. If you look at this photograph here, which shows, amongst other things, the west front of Perth, if you look at the west door here, you'll probably realize that there is something not quite right about it. And if we look at the detail, you can see that there's a problem, that the proportions are completely wrong, because the ground level has risen up around the walls and around the doorway. And in fact, when you go into the church, you have to go down steps about a meter to get into the church. What's happened, and as we saw when we were carrying out these excavations here back in the 1980s and 90s, is that whereas the present Sunday congregation is really quite small on a Sunday morning, there is a much larger congregation under the floor and under the pavement all around the outside of the church, because this was the town's burial ground until the 1580s. And so generations of Perthites have been buried here, and that's raised the level of the ground all around the church, partly sort of submerging it and explaining why the west door, the proportions look so wrong. It's been tidied up and sort of neatened by Robert Lorimer in the 1920s, but he's basically followed the lines of the original medieval moulding, but he can't do anything about the fact that the ground level is all wrong. You can see just here that the moulding is slightly different below ground from what it is above, because that's Lorimer's work, and that's the medieval mouldings below ground now, which should be going down another meter or so to give the Gothic arch its proper proportions. The earliest reasonably accurate map that we have of Perth is Rutherford 1774, which I shall be coming back to quite often. There's a convention that several of the early maps of Perth have north to the right rather than to the top of the page, and that's the case here. So north is over to our right. There's the High Street with St. John's Kirk just there. There's South Street, which is the secondary street of the medieval borough. And here, this line here, which later becomes Mill Street, Medvin Street, Canal Crescent, and Canal Street, is actually the line of the medieval defences and the medieval ditch. And all those things are shown quite well on Rutherford 1774, because at that period, the town hasn't really expanded very much beyond its medieval limits. There's a very early suburb here called New Row, which is medieval as well. And there's the High Street heading off west out of town. And there's South Street heading off and turning left to go south. And that, by a rather roundabout route, takes you eventually to Edinburgh. But overall, the medieval borough is still visible, contained within its medieval lines on Rutherford 1774. You'll notice the burgage plots, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with from medieval towns right across Britain. These sort of herringbone pattern of long, narrow strips running back from the main street frontages, with the buildings along the frontage, and then gardens and workshops and cesspits and various other activities in the backlands behind those frontages. And that's quite a marked feature even of modern Perth, where it hasn't been sort of overwritten by later development. That sequence of burgage plots makes it possible to suggest something of how the town has developed. Some years ago, a colleague of mine, Mike Spearman, worked out a sequence in which the town is expanding. On these plans, again, north is to the right of the view. There's the River Tay. So you have Watergate with a strip of burgage plots and the beginnings of the high street coming back from the river crossing. And we now think that we need to include the enclosure around St. John's Kirk as well, even in this earliest view, because of that ditch that I showed you before. And then progressively, the borough is expanding westwards. We now think westwards around the enclosure around St. John's Kirk. At a certain point, we acquire a castle somewhere in the area to the north of the borough, on ground that actually is somewhat prone to flooding. And then steadily, the borough keeps expanding westwards and eventually expands southwards as well, acquiring South Street. One thing that's quite noticeable is that while there is a river crossing slightly offset from the end of High Street, there's no river crossing at the end of South Street. That comes much later in Victorian times. There's a market cross at the point where the road to the castle and to St. John's Kirk crosses the High Street. That was taken away as an obstruction to traffic in the 19th century, but there's still a granite marker in the pavement to show where the market cross was. And this would have been, in effect, the hub, the absolute center of the medieval borough. The High Street, oddly enough, terminated in a sort of dead end, because you have the toll booth, which is in effect the town hall of the period, built across the end of the High Street. And that survives right up into the 19th century, with an arcade at the bottom of it, which I think you can see, and with arches leading through onto the river frontage where there was a small harbour. The toll booth also was taken away in the 19th century, but the foundations still survive below the pavement, and we have seen them from time to time when drains and other features had to be put through the high street. And we've done watching briefs and found the foundations of the old toll booth. This is a slightly earlier plan of Perth. Rutherford is 1774. This is Pettit 1715. It's more of a sketch plan, but it's the earliest thing we have, and it's really quite good. And you can see there at the end of the high street is the toll booth. He shows the high street somewhat straighter than it really is. He shows the northern suburb developing here. These zigzag features are fortifications added during the Jacobite Rising of 1715. Perth became quite a strategic location as a crossing point of the Tay, as a limit of navigation, and as a way of getting by boat quite a long way west into Scotland without having to use the very rudimentary road system of the period, practically non-existent in the Highlands. If you wanted to travel in the Highlands in this period, almost the only way of doing it was to pay a Highlander to carry you across the rivers and through the bogs and so on. It was an absolutely chaotic way of getting around, which was why it was so difficult for the kings of Scots to exercise their authority anywhere north of Perth. That's why John Shirley talks about the country of the wild Scots as soon as you get north of Dunkeld anyway. But Pett at 1715, who was a military engineer, does give you a fairly good idea of the layout of Perth at that period. I think there's a fair bit of poetic license in these rather elaborate gardens in the open backlands of the borough. I suspect he's left out the foraging pigs and the cesspits and things of that sort, and given Perth a somewhat more ornamental and decorative character than it really had. He has shown here these ornamental gardens here probably do exist because they were the Earl of Gowrie's palace and townhouse, which remained until quite late when it was taken away to allow what became South Street to become a river crossing. But that's a much later development. That feature there, which I'll come back to in a minute, is Greyfriars burial ground, which marks the site of the Blackfriars, of the Greyfriars Monastery. And there's a little harbour, which you can see there at the mouth of what's become the canal. The medieval and early modern Perth is in effect enclosed by a wet ditch and moat, which we'll see more of in a minute. There's a mill stream. The mill lade comes down to this corner of the fortified borough, powers the city mills, which are just up there beyond the edge of the screen. And then the outfall from the mills runs down Mill Street in a wet ditch, and then round here, round Canal Crescent and down Canal Street, which was in effect a canal, to this area here, which was the New Haven by the Greyfriars. So you have a small harbour basin just here by the toll booth. At one time, you would have had boats drawn up on the foreshore here, and then another harbour basin built here, which allowed boats to unload in this area, mainly things like coal, and then be distributed through this canal out to the whole circuit of the borough. The reason I've put this shot up is to show this building here, as it was a few years ago. It's now a very small Sainsbury's Metro with empty floors above, empty for various reasons. It's one of the oldest surviving frontages in the high street. A lot of the frontages along the high street are added to much older buildings, but here you have an 18th century, perhaps earlier building surviving relatively unaltered. And this area below here, which later became Sainsbury's, gave us a chance to look at the structure of the building, look at the quite early timber work inside, and the quite early masonry. This is the basement of that building. Well, that's the ground floor there. That's the basement down below. And as you can see, there's all sorts of different periods of masonry in this structure here, which is in effect the the party wall between this building and the building next door. The centre of Perth in the 18th century had become really quite crowded, and for various reasons, people packed into the centre. So you had inhabited basements, and there are actually fireplaces in this basement, and you had inhabited rooms in the floors above. So you would have shops on the ground floor, but below and above, you would have residential floors, and people were really squeezed in. That was how Scottish boroughs worked. You get the same thing along the Royal Mile in Edinburgh with, for example, Gladstone's Land. If you've ever read The Lord Justice Clerk, which is an unfinished novel by Robert Louis Stevenson, he tries to conjure up the feel of the centre of the old town of Edinburgh in that period, where it still has its medieval character, and where very high status people live on some floors of the building, like the Lord Justice Clerk, who's a senior law lord, and then all sorts of more humble people on other floors of the same building. It's a very distinctive thing. The other thing is the party walls, that because of the way that medieval boroughs develop, unless you're ready to buy up enormous areas of property and redevelop them all together, party walls tend to survive even when the buildings that they separate get demolished, because you can never be quite sure where your building stops and the building next door begins. Or rather, you can be sure when you see daylight. And that's actually happened on some sites that we've worked on, that the people demolishing the building have actually accidentally gone through into the building next door. So party walls are of great structural and historical interest as really encapsulating many phases of masonry, many phases of structure. And the masonry we're looking at here were these fairly small stones, this very irregular masonry, a rather greenish kind of sandstone. We think that's probably quite early medieval masonry, and that these basement walls are much earlier than the walls that form the surviving building above, and that itself is of interest. Internally, the floors above remained inhabited right up into the middle of the 20th century. As you can see, there's a little sign down at the bottom there. That little sign on a sort of paddle that's meant to be stuck out from a window says house to let. And that would have been stuck out when there were rooms going in this, up in the attic of this building. In Scottish terminology, a house really meant a flat. The building as a whole would be a land, and you see that in Dundee with Gardine's Land, which is a very similar sort of building, but somewhat bigger and more complicated. And there was much more of a tradition in Scotland than in England of not only letting out, but actually owning flats separately, one from another. And often they would become entangled together in 3 dimensions. In St. Andrews, for example, where we've done similar work, you get really complicated patterns of ownership where buildings on upper floors sort of interlock with the flats above and below, so that you're resting on somebody else's, on several other people's properties below, and several other people's houses are above you. And it's an absolute nightmare to organize structural repairs or work out who owns what, or what would happen if you took this particular wall away, which is usually catastrophic. So there's, and because the flats above Sainsbury's are really in a poor structural condition, and they had to put a lot of timber in just to keep the building from falling down, it's never been redecorated or redeveloped. And so when we went in there to record the building, before it was being patched up, we had really a kind of time capsule of extreme crowding, extreme sort of squalor to some extent, and all sorts of very interesting graffiti going back into the 1920s on the walls. Yes, that was the area that we were looking at. It's this area here of the High Street. You can see the curve of the high street quite markedly here in Rutherford's plan. And you can also see the line of the defences. This is a small surviving part of the town's defensive ditch, where it still survives as an open watercourse. This is a view taken a few years ago. It's been tidied up since. Many years ago, back in the 1980s, we did an excavation in this area. This fragment of wall here is advertised as the last surviving fragment of Perth medieval wall. And we went down under it, and lo and behold, down here, you have a very, very substantial wall face, quite possibly of the medieval defensive wall. And then the town's lade, the watercourse, is on the outside of it, acting as a sort of moat. That's, if I can find it, yes, that's in this area here. And quite an interesting surviving example of the town's defensive circuit. This is a rather nice reconstruction drawing of Perth at the time of the Reformation, provided courtesy of Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust, showing what the town looked like at that period. And what it shows rather well is the line of the town defences formed by the wet ditch, the harbour at the Grey Friars, the harbour at the toll booth, the line of quite substantial houses along the Watergate, St John's Kirk in the middle of it all, South Street, and here's the Earl of Gowrie's lodgings and rather ornamental gardens and little defensive tower there. You notice that the high street is much wider in the middle than at the ends. It's sort of banana shaped, and it's actually about 2 meters wider on either side than it is today. You can also see all the friaries that, because Perth was actually quite an important place, it attracted a number of religious houses. The Dominican friary up here, roughly on the site of where the King's Castle had been, until it was washed away in a flood of the 1120s, 1209, 1210. You've got the Grey Friars there. And then over here, you have the Charterhouse, the Carthusian monastery, which was set up by James I of Scotland to be a sort of royal mausoleum for the Stuart dynasty, all of them being vandalized and destroyed during the riots that followed John Knox's sermon in St John's Kirk. That's an early piece of road surface surviving at 82-86 High Street, where the buildings have expanded outwards into the road and have sealed the early road surface under the later buildings. You can see here on this bit of the high street here, it's upside down on purpose so as to put north at the top. You can see how the curve of the banana, as it were, has been deliberately straightened out already by 1774. And wherever we've worked, we've seen examples of that. And in fact, 82-86 High Street is in this strip and is a good example of where the street frontage has been pushed forwards and to seal the old street surface. The same thing's happened on the north side as well. And I think, yes, there's a nice example. There's a piece of road surface on the north side of the high street with a little piece of timber preserved on top of the road surface, where a quotation marks temporary stall has been put out in the road 500 years ago and never taken down. That was a common problem. There were endless ordinances issued by the borough council against people putting middens in the street, putting stalls into the street, putting forestairs into the street, and gradually encroaching on the public space. But it happened all the time, and there was no way of stopping it. So that the banana gradually got a bit thinner and a bit straighter than it had been. This is the King James VI Hospital, but it's on the site of the Carthusian, of the Carthusian monastery. The monastery was a much, much bigger site than the present hospital grounds are. because the Carthusian monastery had been is set up as a royal mausoleum for the honor of the Stuart dynasty. And James I himself is buried here. He was murdered in Perth, and he was buried in Perth, but he'd always intended to be buried in Perth. He'd always been intended to be buried here, just not quite so soon as things turned out. We don't know exactly where, but it's in this area. Here is Canal Crescent, just here. There's Hospital Street. That H-shaped block is the hospital, but the hospital lands go right back down to here on Rutherford 1774. And all these rather oblique lines of streets in this area, this is a 1920s view of Perth, reflect the outline of the much older King James boundaries of the Carthusian monastery. The king himself is buried here. His Queen Joan Beaufort, when she died, was buried next to him, but also Henry VIII's older sister, Margaret Tudor, who married into the Stuart dynasty as well. All three of them are ancestors of our present king, and they're also ancestors of the Hohenzollern dynasty of Germany and of its present successors. So these unknown graves, wherever they are, probably back here a bit farther back, if ever they could be found, are of very considerable historical interest and demonstrate how important Perth was in the time of James I of Scotland. We don't know exactly where he is buried. There has been a recent project to survey this area using ground penetrating radar in the hope of finding the outline of the Carthusian monastery, and especially of the Carthusian church, because if you could find that, the king and his royal companions are likely to be buried near the high altar, and so you'd have a good idea of where they were. Not with the thought of digging them up. They are, after all, he's buried where he wanted to be. But just to know and properly commemorate the place of his burial and to be able to properly mark that. So there's a lot going on with our historical map of Perth. It's by no means finished. It will always be a work in progress. If you go to the Greyfriars burial ground, which is down here, and that became a public burial ground in the 1580s after the Franciscan friary was dissolved. There are some very nice 18th century and later stones, many of them with the memento mori tradition of skulls and crossbows and so on. And one of them has on the top of it, life how short, eternity how long. And for those of us who study Perth, that I think is a fair summary of the experience of doing so. I'll stop at that point and catch my breath and allow a bit of time for questions if anybody has. So there we are. I see there's a few questions. Are you going to act as Master of Ceremonies, John?
Well, it looks like it. I don't know. But my impression was that Laura was going to. Here she is.
I was going to give you the first question, John, but if you don't want the first question, that's fine.
Right. Well, being a geographer, David, I'm very interested in the fact about the survival rate. Is it, my take on it is that the archaeological survival of material has benefited from Perth being quite a soggy ground.
Yes.
Is that true?
Very much so. That the anaerobic waterlogged conditions of such a depth have preserved all sorts of things that wouldn't normally survive. All those organic materials that would normally decay have been sealed airtight. And so long as you can keep them in the state in which they were found or conserve them, then all those things like wood and leather and sort of similar organic materials survive to an unusual degree. You get similar preservation in some other waterlogged towns. Like York is a famous example that produces lots and lots of wet and smelly archaeology. The City of London, not all of it, but the bits along the Thames waterfront where the river level has risen, you get some very nice preservation of Roman materials from that area and also from the Fleet River area. But Perth is unusual in having such a broad extent of preserved organic materials sealed into my concept of the medieval cowpat.
I find it very interesting because I've just finished reading C.J. Sanson's novel Heartstone, the Shard Lake series, and that's based on part of it is based on the sinking of the Mary Rose.
Oh,
the
yes.
Survival of the material because it was in water all the time as well.
Very, very similar conditions, yes.
So Scotland, should being such a soggy place, have lots of other sources for you to dig on.
Yes, and
Over
the
to you.
Scottish boroughs are all different. The Perth's special because it's essentially flat, but with this gentle rise, which is all clay and gravel and glacial deposits, but not free draining. And so you have this extensive flat area of waterlogged material. If you go to Dundee, the conditions are totally different. You have an uplifted volcanic geology with all sorts of steps and shelves and breaks in the underlying geology. And you get solid geology coming up to the surface in places. And the archaeology is surviving in dribs and drabs, sealed where it's been caught in a sort of crevice. Whereas in Perth, the solid geology is 77.5 meters down. We know that because somebody actually did a borehole survey using a cone penetrometer. Why they really wanted to know, I'm not sure, but they made up their minds they wanted to know where the solid geology was. And we watched them do this, and about 3 days later, the thing stopped at 77.5 meters down. So now we know. So that's quite a different condition. Edinburgh's different again because you have the crag and tail conditions, volcanic crag with the castle on top, and then a glacial tail going down the Royal Mile to Holyrood, and very different archaeological conditions there. Dunfermline is also a crag and tail formation. So every Scottish borough is slightly different in the way that its geology affects its shape and its archaeology.
Thank you very much.
From a cartographic point of view, that's what makes Perth interesting.
Thank you, John, and thank you, David, as well on my behalf. As Paul said at the start of the session, my name's Laura, and I am one of the trustees of the British Association for Local History. And despite my accent, I'm coming from that other well-known waterlogged location of York, because I work for the University of York as well. Yes. So I'm going to run through, we've got some questions in the chat. I've also got one of my own, but if I'd have no time for mine, that is fine. So I'm going to start with Tim Carmichael and just take these in order and see how we go. This is where my accent comes in handy. So Tim is asking, Balhousie Castle on North Inch dates from the 15th century and wants to know whether it had a strategic significance and did it have any role in the Covenanter times?
It won't have had a huge strategic significance. I mean, it's a tower house at its core. So it's more of a fortified residence, more of a private than a public or royal monument. I don't know is the answer whether it played a significant part in the Covenanter events. But I think it's not a major military castle really. I mean, it's now the Black Watch Museum, but it's fundamentally it's a fortified house, and the fortification is as much for show as for reality. We did some archaeology inside it some years ago when when the MOD passed it over from the regiment to a private trust, they did a grand reordering of the insides and so on, and we watched them cut various holes in the walls without it collapsing. So that was quite interesting, but I don't think it's not fundamentally a really serious military fortification.
Thank you. That's also a place that I've spent quite a lot of time because it's got very nice cafe.
Yes,
So
yes.
moving on to the next question we've got from Bet. You mentioned John Knox and John Knox's sermon.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the riots that followed that sermon that lead to the destruction of the friaries?
Mm. Yes, there's a great gathering of the supporters of John Knox in Perth. There's a sort of slow burning confrontation between John Knox and Mary Queen of Scots. And he's pushing the limits of what he can get away with. And he preaches his sermon in St. John's Kirk against the sin of idolatry, which is a very and he means the sort of religion that Mary Queen of Scots approves of. So it's very provocative. And when he's finished, it's actually time for one of the regular services through the day in St. John's Kirk. And the spectacle of the priest coming in and setting things up ready to celebrate the Mass in front of all these fierce Protestants completely it causes everything to erupt. John Knox calls it the rascal multitude, which is interesting because he's sort of distancing him. I think in a way what has happened is not perhaps entirely displeasing to him, but he's not unwilling to distance himself from responsibility for it. And so there is a riot. They remove a lot of the ornamentation and what they perceive as idolatrous features in St. John's Kirk itself, and then go around all of the religious houses in Perth, which are, as we saw on the map, plus the one that's out to the west beyond the edge of the map, the Whitefriars, and strip out a lot of the decorative features that they object to. The monasteries aren't immediately demolished; that comes afterwards. But this initial stripping out of their decoration is a sort of an important turning point. It's a very complicated story because eventually, when the monasteries are dissolved, the brothers are often allowed to live out on a pension still in the buildings. And some of them decide to go with the flow. So one of the priests from, I think it's from the Whitefriars, ends up as the minister of Tippermuir in the Protestant church. I think there's a lot going on beneath the surface. It's not a simple, straightforward thing. But yes, it is a very significant change in the texture of Perth. If you read the Muses' Threnody, which is a 16th or no, 17th century extended poem, which is just in the point of being republished, of reflecting on the history and archaeology of Perth from that perspective, they look back with a kind of, with Protestant disapproval, but with patriotic pride at the Roman Catholic heritage of medieval Perth, and they sit on the fence very cleverly in how they feel about it. And so it's not simple or straightforward.
Don't think anything in Scottish history is. So
No.
that was a very good answer for that one. Thank you. I've got a comment from Nigel, which I wholeheartedly agree with. So Nigel's saying that it's worth telling people that many archaeological finds are now on display in the wonderful new museum for Perth Museum, opposite St John's Kirk in the city centre, which again I would thoroughly recommend because I have been.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So Stephen's got a question. He's asking, how significant do you think the Cromwellian occupation was for Perth's surviving buildings? And did the citadel use up a lot of the borough's stonework?
Yes, it did. I didn't have time to say so much about that, but yes, the Cromwell citadel was built on the South Inch, and that meant that it's an artillery fort, and that meant that it could control river access upstream to Perth. And yes, they did strip out a lot of stonework from around Perth. including a lot of the early gravestones from Greyfriars, which is why Greyfriars Perth is different from Greyfriars Dundee. That Greyfriars Dundee, also known as the Howff, has quite a few 17th century stones. In Perth, there are very few of those surviving, but there's just a handful from the 17th and perhaps even the 16th centuries in Greyfriars Perth, but lots and lots of really nice stones from the 18th century. And that is because so much was taken away to build Cromwell's citadel. We did do some excavations on Cromwell's citadel some years ago, confirming its location in the South Inch and confirming the presence of the ditch and the survival below ground of the stone facings of the ramparts. That artillery forts were deliberately given a low profile because you don't want to expose a target to the other side's artillery. So you have a deep ditch and then a fairly low rampart upstanding above the ditch with a gun platform on top of it. When the fortifications went out of use, basically the ditch was infilled with rubbish. A lot of the stone facing was taken over because that was the good quality stone. And the ramparts were reduced back down to modern ground level, but they didn't fully excavate the foundations below ground down in the ditch. And so those still survive underground, often with their facing stones gone.
Fantastic. Looking at things below ground, Elizabeth has got a question which is actually a really interesting one. Are there any plans for further excavations in the historic centre of the borough, so the historic centre of Perth?
Not exactly plans, because you never know what will happen. At the moment, the town centre is really struggling a bit. We did some quite substantial excavations inside the city halls in advance of the new museum. And I am in hiding trying to finish the report on that before I get sort of hung, drawn and quartered. But and those were interesting. There aren't any major developments planned that I can think of in the town centre at the moment. But the town centre is struggling somewhat in retail terms. I saw a thing in Perth High Street a couple of years ago, which sounds like the beginning of a naughty story about Aberdeen, which is a closing down sale in a pound shop.
You're talking to the Aberdonians, so be very careful.
Yeah. So and that's the and all along the high street and along South Street, there's an awful lot of buildings that are now vacant, or they're charity shops or they're pound shops. So and some of them are falling into disrepair. But I don't think major redevelopment's the solution for that. So no one really knows what's going to happen in the town centre of Perth in the future. But I don't know of any major redevelopments, but things can change, and there might be a need for further excavation in the town centre.
I think that's what we rely on here in York as well. For new excavations, you're waiting for a developer to come along and actually want to change a building or want to do changes to ground floors and basements, and you're reliant on those developers to then.
At the moment, I think
it's
going to be keyholes within existing buildings rather than large-scale redevelopments, because I don't see that there's really the justification or the appetite for large-scale redevelopment in the town centre at the moment.
I've got a follow-up question from Bet, but I'm going to throw in my question now, only because you made the comparison between Perth and Edinburgh, and I'm now spending quite a lot of time in Perth, but I spent quite a lot of my life living in Edinburgh as a university student and then with my first job, and I used to volunteer for Gladstone's Land, so I'm very keen on that comparison.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, what brings people to Perth in that 18th century and that population boom? Or is it like Edinburgh, where you're living within a defensive wall and actually that's what's causing the population to increase because they're limited in space? Or is there another reason that's bringing people into Perth?
You do get a massive increase steadily throughout the 18th and 19th centuries and into the early 20th. A lot of that is just population growth. A lot of it is depopulation of the highlands. But as the highland economy is changing, as the road systems are going out into the highlands, and the old highland way of life is coming under enormous stress, that is driving people out of the highlands into the boroughs to look for work. Perth doesn't see itself as an industrial town, but it was. Linen weaving and all sorts of other things were going on in the town centre, and that was drawing people in. There's not a large inward movement of Irish people as there was in Dundee, but not that I know of anyway. But there is the general movement inwards. Of course, the collapse of the Jacobite rising of the 45 has a huge impact in switching off the benign neglect approach to the Highlands, which the government had had up until then. And so everything is changing much faster after that. If you remember Sorley MacLean's famous poem about Culloden, how it's a breaking of the society. So when you get, for example, Johnson and Boswell exploring Scotland at the very end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, they are looking for a way of life that's gone, and they realize they're a generation too late. And that's really what's driving people in. The way that Scottish property laws worked and taxation laws meant that there were strong incentives to keep within existing building footprints and existing town footprints and build upwards rather than sprawl outwards. That because a lot of land taxes were tied to the land and there were restrictions on what you could do out with those areas. So that tends to create the incentive for staying inside the medieval boundaries and squeezing people in. So you get that phenomenon. When you look at the 19th century maps of Perth, you have a church every street corner and a public house every 5 doors because people are so squeezed into the centre. And that all evaporates after the Second World War. Suddenly, the sort of those restrictions are lifted and everybody's moving out into the suburbs. So that the population of Perth today is about 45,000. The population of the town centre is about 3,000, which is about the same as it was in the Middle Ages or less. So you've had this really interesting change. And it affects all kinds of things. The number of pubs that are closing in the town centre and the number of churches that have closed over the years because the people have moved out.
Brilliant. I am going to come to Bet's follow-up question. So this was the question about John Knox. So you mentioned the rascal crowd stripped out the idolatrous material.
Yes.
So wanting to know, did they actually nick it? Did they steal it? Or did they just rip it out?
I think they probably took away quite a lot of it. When we excavated the Blackfriars site back in the 1980s, we were finding lots of things like window lead and window glass and that sort of thing, which implies a fairly systematic demolition and salvaging of materials. So there's an organized quotation marks recycling of the material from the monasteries, and when Derek carried out his excavations more recently at the Whitefriars, you're getting lots of evidence of stone wall foundations being taken away and that sort of thing. So there's lots of recycling of building materials. The general severe shortage of timber in Scotland tends to mean that structural timbers get fairly avidly borrowed as well. So I mean, the rascal multitude probably weren't set up, but really for stealing anything that wasn't readily portable. But there's a definite systematic demolition and recycling that follows, after that period.
Fantastic. Well, I can't see any more questions in the question and answer, so I think you're off the hook. Thank you so much, David, for your talk tonight. I've got the job of wrapping up this session. So on behalf of John, Paul and myself, thank you to David for your excellent talk. We've had some fantastic thank yous in the comments as well tonight. for your presentation. As Paul mentioned at the start of the session, this is just the first in a series of 4 talks as part of our collaboration with the Historic Towns Trust. So on the 25th of February, we will be looking at Bradford. We will be looking at Ripon on the 25th of March. And then we're going to be looking at City of Flows, Chester 400 to 1500 on the 29th of April. So thank you so much to everybody tonight for your contributions in the question and answer, for your contributions in the comments, and hopefully we'll be able to see you at one of our talks again in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.